Hello, my friends. Welcome to my show. This is what I do on Thursdays, pretty much the last 3+ years. So I'm glad you're here. I'm going to say 3+ years until I actually figure out how long I've been doing this. We're about to hit 200 episodes, so that's pretty exciting. We have no plans made, but I'm sure we'll do something for a nice round number like 200. So thanks for being here. If you're live with me in chat, that's perfect because that's why I do these monthly Udemy Q&As. So maybe you're in the middle of my course now. Maybe you've heard about my course, but you haven't checked it out. Maybe you finished one of my courses and you're just coming back to see what's new. Like Dan, checking out what's new. Maybe we'll talk about a few things today. But this is no guest, nothing planned other than just some news, announcements, the typical stuff. And then we jump into your questions and let's see where that takes us. Anything DevOps, containers, Docker, Kubernetes, any of that stuff's fair game. But let me get the announcements out of the way real quick. So in case you haven't been here before, this is member sponsored. I do no ads. I don't have any sponsors. And when I do in the future, maybe I will definitely let you know if that's a sponsored ad or something. But you are the sponsors of this show, the podcast, the open source, the blog posts, the Discord server. All these things are member supported as a part of my efforts to run the little DevOps community. And that happens over on Patreon, at least for now. We're working on some other things, maybe some stuff here on YouTube. You know, you can join YouTube channels now, so we're considering that. Let me know if that's something you're interested in instead of Patreon. We also have other ways in the future you're going to be able to support this community and my work here in open source. That will include things you can do now, like our Discord server, which has hit over 11,000 people. That's a crazy number. That's a crazy number in there. So please check it out. It's at devops.fan right above me. And it's got great new features now, including it shows events, so you can see the event details for what's happening right now. And you can see future events, like everything that I'm doing, essentially. We have the high fivers next week. So in case you didn't know, over on Patreon, if you don't have to give me money, you can just scroll down and click the follow button, and you'll get a weekly update on everything I'm creating, who's going to be on the podcast, who's going to be on the live show, all that stuff. But if you jump over to Discord, you can see that we have a hangout. I can't say it right. A hangout every month for the high fivers. So if you sponsor me with essentially a cup of coffee, you will get access to a Discord chat room where a small group of us, usually less than 10, we just hang out every month and we talk about DevOps topics. We've talked recently about how we stay up to date and how we train. We've talked recently about how you hire or how you stay hired in DevOps. And we've talked about our own code, we've brought YAML and Docker files before. Like, you know, it's just random stuff, right? People working in DevOps trying to solve problems together for like an hour or two every month. So you can check that out. And in case you didn't know, you can see all the events happening in my community over here. We just launched a new feature on Discord, which is actually like a forum now built in here. So what doesn't Discord do, right? We are now going to start trying Q&As for the courses, and got some opinions in there on how to use them. And so, yeah, come hang out with us. Come check it out. That's totally free. If you want to do the high fivers, that's $5 a month. And in case you didn't know, this show turns into a podcast. Not maybe this particular episode, although we are considering that, taking the answers to your questions and turning them into short little clips on YouTube or something. Maybe its own podcast. Who knows? You let me know in chat or in comments. Next up, we got so much stuff going on here. We launched the merch store that I'm calling the Loot Box a couple months ago. And Foxy, our mascot from a couple of my courses, has invaded the Loot store. So Loot Box has now Foxy stuff. That would be the fox. And Foxy in her pirate costume is coming up for KubeCon. So we launched a Kubernetes themed shirt and swag, including my favorite. There's a sweatshirt in here that I'm going to be wearing. So if you're going to KubeCon, make sure you jump in the Discord chat server, and there is a KubeCon channel right here. So if you're going to be there, or at least if you're going to be watching online, we're going to have a little KubeCon party this time. And if you're going to be there in the real world in Detroit, I definitely want to meet you, fist bump. Maybe we have a drink or a lunch together or something, whatever we can figure out. So I'm going to be scheduling all that over here in the Discord server in case you're going. Please come let me know. And I'm going to be wearing this DevOps fan, pimping out our fantastic Discord community. I'm going to be doing that all week. But in case you want to get some stuff, this is my wife's idea. And she thought maybe someone would want a water bottle with not just the DevOps Love logo, but also my face. So I don't know if this is a good idea, but she said maybe someone wants to drink out of a water bottle with your face on it. At least a caricature of my face, right? So there's also a coffee cup version if you'd like that. I have this fantastic coffee cup. I love the two-tone. That's actually kind of fun. Anyway, a lot of this stuff, some of these designs are sponsoring the artists that made them, and some of them are just made from our internal team. And that's fantastic. So we've got lots of ideas there. Like SneakerNet is something that I came up with. In case you weren't around in the 90s in tech, we actually used to have this thing called SneakerNet where you had to walk the data over. It was actually faster to walk it over with a USB stick or a CD-ROM than it was to rely on Ethernet. So we called that SneakerNet, and you can now get that on a t-shirt. And it's actually on Wikipedia, in case you didn't know. It's a real thing. I didn't make up that term. We also have, for you bare metal fans that love bare metal DevOps, we have a whole section of bare metal stuff, including this tour-looking shirt of a bear playing metal. Get it? And he's got a keyboard guitar because those are really cool in the 80s, except for it's a different kind of keyboard guitar. I love this one. Anyway, that's where our Love DevOps sticker came from, was the bear was wearing it. We thought, well, we should turn that into its own thing. So we created a tattoo sticker kind of sort of the DevOps. Anywho, so that happened. Oh, and what else? Course updates. So everyone asks about course updates on here. You should keep asking because there's constantly stuff happening. In case you didn't know, let me give you the coupon. I swear I'm almost done with all of our announcements. But this link right here, you can check out my updates in the course and see what's happening next. So what I just finished, and the team helped me with, was getting the installation videos up to date. We've also fixed some Kubernetes stuff for the kube control run command. That is still in progress because, believe it or not, there's over a dozen videos that have to be replaced just because the run command has been changed in the last 2.5 years. So that is still happening. A couple of those have happened, and there's more that's going on. And then a new section actually coming to each course. Docker Mastery is getting a new section on more advanced Docker files. Kubernetes Mastery is getting a new section on storage. And away we go, right? There's more broken and degraded lectures because things are always changing in container land. And then there's new stuff as well coming. So the rest of my year is all about that stuff. I've actually slowed down my consulting to pick back up more of this coursework. So let me know in chat. What do you think about that? What do you love and hate about my courses? Lastly, in case you weren't here last month, we announced the launch of a new Docker extension. So if you haven't gotten in on Docker desktop extensions, they are the 2022 hit of Docker. Like, that's basically the biggest thing that I think that they released so far this year is the Docker desktop extensions. There's some really cool ones there, including things about VPN, including weird ones like setting up an OpenShift cluster inside of Docker desktop. Like, great I would say creative extensions. And the last one was something based on an idea I had, something I created called Backup a few years ago for backing up your volumes. It was a simple shell script, and Felipe and the team at Docker ran with that and made an entire extension that's way better than my little shell script that you can now get for free. You can actually just go here on this blog page. It'll link you to the extension and let you download that for free into your Docker desktop. And it essentially would do just that. It'll back up your volumes locally on your machine. It'll let you clone them locally or to a remote server. If you have SSH to that server or that Docker engine, it'll allow you to put them in a registry. It'll allow you to restore from a registry, and they keep adding more features. The captains are throwing in a bunch of features to this thing, so it's just got a new feature to add labels so that if you're using a container in Compose and it has a volume, and you want to back up that compose-based volume, send it to a registry, let your coworkers or friends download it, and also run it in Compose, it can now do that with labels, because the way that Compose does things is with labels. It uses metadata to figure out what services and what volumes are used where, and now it captures those as well. So that's really all the news that I had. There's nothing major. I mean, obviously we've had major things in the community, like Kubernetes 125 came out, I believe, last month. Docker hasn't released a new engine version in years, so we don't have that to talk about, but Docker Compose keeps getting new features. So if you're using Docker Compose at the command line, hopefully this will be my last little rant. If you're using Docker Compose, do you know that Docker Compose v2, which was officially released and went GA this year, you now type Docker space Compose instead of dash Compose, and you get all the old features that you're used to, all the standard commands you're used to and options, but you now have new stuff, new features, and it's faster. It comes built in with Docker now. It's not a separate Python download. I think it shaves off like 200 milliseconds for every command. It's great. So take away the dash, always use a space. It's now an apt package as well. So when you use the get.docker.com script, right? For those of you that have taken my courses, you know get.docker.com is the quickest way to install the engine. And in here, this now installs Compose as well, because Compose has changed from Python as a binary to a Golang binary that is shipped in its own app package and goes in as a plugin to the Docker command itself. So you just get that by doing the standard Docker install. If you look down there, you can see that this is the name of the package, Docker Compose plugin, and it will add that to your installation now on servers, which didn't used to be a thing. It, of course, comes with Docker Desktop 2, which is now on Linux. In case you have not noticed, in the last 4 or 5 months, Docker has released Docker Desktop for Linux. So now it works across Mac, Windows, and Linux, all the latest versions. On Linux, it doesn't work on every distribution. Like I've heard of issues. I've had issues with Mint, although I've heard other people getting it to work. I've heard of it having issues on Pop! OS. I don't know. They don't test with every distribution of Linux. They do the major ones, right? Ubuntu, Debian, maybe some of the Yum-based ones. But all right, let's get into it. Seeing some chat. That's all the announcements. Is the Discord better than a Slack channel? Absolutely. So Slack is still there for those that are maybe doing this at work. There's 40,000 accounts in Slack. So there's lots of people in there, but most aren't active anymore because the community features of Discord are just so much better than Slack. Slack has always been a hardcore business tool. They have focused exclusively on the business community. Sadly, I wish that like the Kubernetes community and the CNCF and the Docker communities would all go over to Discord. They do have variants on Discord, but the official ones are still in Slack. I don't like Slack for community because there are no community features. I can't ban someone. I can't block someone. I can't do a lot of the things that a typical IRC chat would do. All of that is now in Discord. Discord now has the new Q&A forum feature. It has events. It has, you can do sort of live streams and other things in it that are way different than Slack, and it's all free. Like, I pay for this channel. You're welcome. We actually have a sponsor in this channel. One of the moderators does sponsor this channel, and you can too. If you want to go in, you can say boost and boost the server. Eric, if you're not on, thanks, Eric. Eric Smalling is the other booster, but if you boost this server, we get more and more features. I've taken on that responsibility myself, so I've boosted it, I think, like 5 or 6 times or something, and we get a lot of the new features like audio chats and better audio, better video streaming. We get a little icon of Foxy that wags her tail. That's the kind of stuff we get when we pay in Discord. So I don't like that with Slack because Slack you can't pay for Slack in an open community. It would cost me $100,000 to pay for Slack every month or something. So Slack is there in case you have to use it for work, and it's the only way you can get into the community. But the community, and if you look at the courses now, they officially say like Discord is the preferred way to hang out with the community. So definitely check that out. Oh, thank you. Can't recommend the Hangout enough. Yeah, the monthly Hangout's pretty fun. Any pros or cons about GitLab Container Registry? I have not used it other than their public one on their official website. And container registries are pretty much container registries. So that's a great question. There are differencing features when you talk about like cloud versions versus hosted versions. If you're using it in your environment, I would say that you're probably using the container registry is just another utility of a lot of internal systems. So if you're a company that has GitLab Enterprise, or I don't know what they call the custom paid for version in your company that you host yourself, then you're probably using their container registry. If you're using GitHub Enterprise, you're probably using their container registry. If you're sort of super CNCF open sourcey, then you might be using Harbor. Harbor is probably the most popular open source registry for local use. I have a few lectures in the courses about Docker's registry, but I don't recommend anyone run that in production because all of these tools are using the registry underneath. They're just wrapping a lot of extra functionality. There's another one, I think it's called Kraken or something like that. There's another one called Portus, Port.us. There's lots of open source registries out there, but like if you're someone who uses JFrog has a registry built in, so you're probably going to be using theirs. I think that registries are sort of a utility at this point, kind of like Git storage for Git repos. So wherever you're storing your artifacts, that's probably going to be where you're going to store your containers. I store some on Docker Hub. I also store a lot of mine on GitHub in the GitHub cloud, because they don't rate limit there on GitHub like Docker Hub does, but I sort of do both. And if I had to choose one internally in my company, I would just say Harbor, because that's the one that isn't specific to a particular tool, and it's the one I've used in open source for enterprise use. You know, it has single sign-on, it has automatic image scanning, it can block the reuse of tags, so that's a nice feature to prevent people from accidentally reusing the same tag. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting features in there that are very enterprise ready. So yeah, check those out. Let's see. Great question. On the Docker Swarm extra stuff. Yeah. Are you talking about, the Docker Swarm for the course? Yeah. I don't know when I'm going to get to that because I got to update the other courses first, but we'll see. Nerd Control. All right. Kamajaru, let's see. Nerd Control. Nerd Control is an alternate command line for humans to manage Containerd as a replacement for the Docker command line and Docker engine. So if you didn't want to use the Docker engine, or for some reason couldn't, and you wanted to use just Containerd doesn't, it has a command line CTR, but it's very limited. Nerd Control does more than that. So Nerd Control is meant for you to run on your local machine. If you're running something like Rancher Desktop, it might be default out of the box. These are all things you would use if you didn't have Docker Desktop, if you didn't have Docker Engine on Linux. So, go check it out. It's pretty cool. I mean, it basically does the same stuff. There are slight little differences, but it's meant to be a drop-in replacement for Docker command line. So go check that out. It's pretty cool. It's actually made by one of the Moby sort of maintainers out of Japan, I believe. So it's a legitimate project run by the community. It's pretty great. What is a stateful set and daemon set in Kubernetes? Can you please help on it? Well, you have many ways to create a pod. A pod is the lowest unit or resource that you can manage in Kubernetes, and a pod can have one or more containers, usually just one container. But that pod can be deployed at least 4, 5, 6 different ways. And the default way is deployment, which just means make one or more replicas of this pod. If you need a daemon set, which is something where each node has to run it, that might be some security scanner or some sort of logging or monitoring tool that you need to run on every node, that would be a daemon set. If you need to run a database and you have to care more about the name of the database server, maybe it has a replica and they need to have persistent names and the same IP addresses, that kind of thing, which I'd rather the cloud do that. I'd rather not have to do that myself. But if you had to do that yourself, that would be a stateful set. And it has a little bit more sort of, I would say, legacy features in it. Not legacy of Kubernetes, but it manages legacy tools like a MySQL server with a replica where they have to have the same name, they have to have the same IP, and they have to be able to find each other to connect and replicate. And so you might do that with a stateful set. But most of our work, 95% of our work is all going to be deployments, just standard deployments. You've also got cron jobs and jobs. Just jobs are one-time things. Cron jobs are scheduled jobs. So you have those as well. Those all run pods. All of them are just a little wrapper around a pod, and it gives you some extra control depending on what type of pod you need to deploy. Can we get a Docker Swarm Pirate Foxy mug? I don't have any Swarm gear. Part of the trick is I try to not break any copyright rules with Docker and Kubernetes, so I have to be a little careful. I do have the Kubernetes logo on one, so we'll have to figure out what we can do with Swarm stuff. I've actually already had problems trying to upload shirts and designs that look like other things. The companies we print through, the internet is pretty strict, and there's only so many places you can go that will let you set up a store, run everything for you, and then drop ship and print things on demand. There's like 4 or 5 of those places that are really popular, and they're really strict on anything that looks like anything that already exists. It's pretty tough, actually. Redbubble and other ones don't seem to care, but they don't let us set up our own shop with our own design and look and do that kind of thing. So how can we do some projects in DevOps? Well, you need to learn the tools first. So the way you sort of get into DevOps is you learn what DevOps is, and that doesn't mean you're learning the tools. You got to learn the fundamentals of DevOps. I don't yet have that course, although we have been working on it for a while, but it's not going to happen this year. But there is a good one on LinkedIn. There's one called DevOps Foundations, I believe is what it's called. It's a really great one out of a couple of guys in Texas. And they're some of the original people from the DevOps movement. I recommend that course. And once you've learned those basics, then you can start learning tools. Once you've learned some tools, and I recommend learning the tools with a project, find something that you're interested in. And what you want to do is you want to codify it. You want to make infrastructure as code. You want to automate it so that every time you update the code for that app, it automatically makes new images. It tests the images. It builds the images. It stores them in a registry. Those are the kind of things that you do in DevOps is you automate and you codify. You make all of your infrastructure as code. So you would want to use Terraform and Ansible and some of these other tools to actually document in a data language or a coding language how you make your infrastructure. That's a lot of what DevOps do. And we often deal with stuff in the middle, right? Programmers make apps. Someone else is dedicated to running them on servers, and we do a lot of the stuff in the middle. Sometimes we get into development. Sometimes we get into the ops where we're building clusters. But DevOps is usually about the stuff in between the dev and the ops, right? So if you're doing more cluster building and managing with Kubernetes clusters, there might be a DevOps component to your job, but I would call you maybe more of an ops engineer than DevOps engineer. I don't know if that helps, but you need to do stuff that you're interested in. So you need to learn the tools. Maybe you're making your own website. Maybe you're making your own blog, or you want to set up some demo apps. There's tons of demo apps on GitHub. Just search GitHub for demo apps. You can search for like Google Cloud demo app or microservices demo app, and you'll find really popular repositories that you can then figure out, how do I put it in containers? How do I auto build it and test it? How do I automatically ship it to my cluster and update it every time that the code changes? That's a lot of what DevOps ends up doing, spending our time on at least. So, great question. Is there any tutorial or guidance on how to manage TLS security, CSRs, CRTs, and certificates under Kubernetes, particularly when using ingress objects? you might look for, a lot of this is going to relate certificate stuff. Usually there's the sort of official project in Kubernetes called Certificate Manager. So that's one thing that you should be learning. Try to use Certificate Manager, read the documents, the step-by-step. Certificate Manager has a tutorial, I believe. Not every method that you're going to use Certificate Manager for is going to be able to use Cert Manager. So Cert Manager over here, this is probably the most popular way to store certificates. There are other tools that will use the certificates. Some of them actually will store them inside the app. For example, Traffic, which is an ingress and proxy. Traffic will, let's just go to Traffic. So the Traffic proxy will go and actually get Let's Encrypt certificates. And in a single node environment, it will install them. It'll sort of store them itself. I don't believe it stores them in Cert Manager yet. If you use their enterprise solution, it does centralized storage. And I'm not sure if it actually stores them in Cert Manager or if it stores them in its own. But their enterprise product is more for when you're actually using this for business. But my point is that you're going to need to learn ingress first. You don't have to learn TLS for that. So you definitely need to know ingress. You need to know services in Kubernetes. And then you probably want to dive into Cert Manager, look into their docs, and run through the getting started stuff. That's going to teach you some basic stuff about Let's Encrypt, because you're going to need to know Let's Encrypt. If you need to know about certificates nowadays, you got to know about Let's Encrypt, because most of us are now getting our certificates from Let's Encrypt. And even if you're in a data center, you can still use Let's Encrypt. A lot of people don't realize that. You don't have to have public websites to use Let's Encrypt. Now, it is kind of hard to use Let's Encrypt if you are offline or if your servers can't access the internet. But if they can, Let's Encrypt. So you're going to need to learn about that and how to store those in Cert Manager and how to assign those certs to particular endpoints in your ingress provider, right? So ingress is a resource that comes with Kubernetes, but you have to pick something like Traffic or Contour. So Project Contour, I've had both of these on the show before, Traffic and Contour. They're probably two of the biggest proxies, as well as Nginx. Nginx obviously is one of the most popular ones because it's the only officially maintained one by the Kubernetes project. But it doesn't necessarily mean that Nginx is better or even the most popular, in my opinion. It is actually probably the most popular just because it's used by default. But if you're in the cloud, the clouds tend to have their own, right? AWS has their own. The other clouds will have their own, where they're providing hardware, ingress, load balancers, and stuff like that. A lot of times you only need to mess with these projects if you're hosting your own cluster. And so if you're in the cloud, just use what the cloud prefers. If you're on your own, you might even be in a distribution that comes with its own ingress provider for you, so you've already been provided one. But if you're just sort of building your own thing, which I really don't recommend most of us do, but if you're just trying to learn Cert Manager, learn Contour, learn Traffic. These are all the things that I think a good ingress, load balancer, service engineer needs to know about. The only one I can think of in terms of training, other than the documentation, is let's see if I get it right. Yeah, so Brian has a couple of courses, and he was on my show recently. Actually, he's going to be on my show again next month, I believe. So Brian is another Docker captain, and he has a course on Traffic. I don't know if that Traffic course talks heavily about TLS. No, he does talk about, he has 5 lectures on that, about the different types of challenges using Let's Encrypt, so that's good. Middlewares are actually a really cool thing to allow you to do advanced processing of your stuff. Yeah. So yeah, go check that out. See if that'll help you. He's going to be on the show next month, so you can ask him questions then. All right. Great question. All right, Dan saying, I have problems using Docker on Windows Server. on EC2. It only works for bare metal and am given HVM virtualization. Can I connect my Docker client on Windows to a Linux EC2 Docker-D as the server? Yes, Dan, it feels like a couple of questions. So as of right now, to catch everybody up, if you're talking about Windows Server, Docker doesn't make the daemon for Windows Server anymore. That is maintained by Mirantis. So Windows Server Engine, I think is what it's called. You may already know this, but Microsoft stopped shipping the latest Docker-D, and Mirantis now makes what they call the Mirantis Container Runtime. It's essentially a fork of Docker, right? And it acts the same way as Docker, but it runs like you would expect on the server in Windows Server. So if you're wanting the latest, you want to get that from Mirantis. I believe they have an open source version, and then you pay optionally for support. I don't quote me on that, but I believe that's how you do it with Mirantis. So that's Windows Server. All right, if you're running a Docker-D engine, which I believe the Mirantis Container Runtime is Docker daemon compatible, you can run that daemon as long as you have SSH access to the server. So on Windows, you would need to install an SSH server on Windows Server. There is the official one from Microsoft that you can enable. And then once you've done that, you use your local command line client, which I describe, actually, if I go back to YouTube, I just posted some servers here. And if you do this, let's see, which one is it? It's the Docker engine for Linux servers. So if you watch this, video, that video talks about how you use your local command line client with an environment variable to point your local Docker command line to any Docker server. And so whether that's Linux or Windows servers, as long as they're running a Docker-D engine, I haven't tested this with Mirantis Container Runtime, so I assume it still works. Tell me if it doesn't. I would be surprised if it doesn't. I would think that Mirantis would want to be fully compatible. But if you're running Docker daemon on a standard Linux server, absolutely, from your local machine, just watch that video. Essentially, you just change the Docker host environment variable, and you do that just by doing something like export Docker host like that, and then you're typing in // that tells your Docker command line which server to talk to. By default, if you don't have that environment variable, it just looks for a local socket. So that's what works on your local machine. But if you change that Docker host environment variable, and then you run a Docker command, it will run against that engine, wherever that engine lives, as long as you have SSH access. You can also do it with Docker context, where you can save your different configurations into a Docker context, much like a kube control context. But I don't always do that because unless I run the server a long time and I need to get back to it over and over again, I'm usually setting this up because I have a temporary server that I just want to test something. And so I would just change that. So hopefully that helps you. Good luck, Dan. Anything new about Windows Hyper-V and virtualized Intel VT nested virtualization? Joe, I'm assuming you're asking that question because you have a problem with it. As far as I know, nothing has changed in years. So nested virtualization with Docker Desktop, if that's what you're asking about, it's something I've been using since the dawn of Docker Desktop. I use a Windows server running Hyper-V with Windows 11 and 10 desktop VMs in Hyper-V that have nested virtualization enabled in Hyper-V that have worked for 5+ years now, ever since Docker Desktop was created. I think there was one time for like 6 months it was broke, but that was like back in 2018 or something. So Joe, if you have any other questions like that, ask them here. Or if you want to discuss it further, that's why we have the Discord over there, the DevOps fan, for chat that can't make it into this discussion. But as far as I know, virtualization just works. Nested virtualization works as long as you enable it. I'm on a Mac, and I run Parallels to run Windows, ARM-based Windows, inside of my ARM-based Mac, and I have to enable nested virtualization in Parallels, it works. That way I can run Windows inside my Mac. And if the ARM version of Docker Desktop existed for Windows, which it doesn't, I would be able to run that locally, but I can't. So in case you are confused by all that, is a lot of layers there. But the point is that Docker has not made a Docker Desktop for Windows on ARM, which is not a new thing, but I guess there's not enough people using ARM yet on the Windows world like there are on Macs. Enough for for Docker to be motivated enough to make a Docker Desktop for Windows on ARM. Whew, that's a lot to say. Alan says, I found no keys to Docker. Okay, so you're talking about the Kubernetes CRTs and stuff like that. Yeah, I don't have any direct advice for you, so the stuff I gave you hopefully will get you somewhere. Yeah. Hello, thanks for learning on my course. All right. What is the trending and new DevOps tools in the market? I still think if you're just not learning Docker, you shouldn't be worried about that. Like if you're learning Docker, you need to learn Docker, and then you're going to learn Kubernetes, and then you're going to have so many things on Kubernetes you're going to learn that, there's right now dozens of platforms, cloud-based platforms, vying for your dollar and eyeballs to automate your DevOps. I am personally not a fan of just hopping to any old platform, especially these closed platforms that you can't use for free. They might have a free limited edition, but they're purely, we all love Terraform. It's been around forever, but Terraform and Ansible, for the reasons that they can be used without a centralized cloud, or they don't require even servers. You can talk directly from your machine to the things you're controlling. There's lots of different ways to use those tools. And we've got newer tools like Pulumi, which is great, but it's not for everyone because it requires that you program in an actual language to do your DevOps. And maybe you're not a developer who's doing DevOps. Maybe you're more of an operator or more of a sysadmin that you maybe know some shell scripting, but you're not a day-to-day hardcore developer. Pulumi is not for you. Pulumi is more for the dev side of things. So there's a lot of other DevOps platforms. In fact, what's interesting is that I think in the next 5 years, we will see solid consolidation of all these platforms, and that you'll end up with the same major players that we have today, like Microsoft with GitHub and Azure, and you have GitLab as a competitor to that, and you have a few other major platforms, the Bitbucket and that whole world. These are all tools that are vying for your attention and creating new tools all the time, improving their automation, and it's going to be hard to beat these billion-dollar companies, right? So I don't expect a lot of these smaller players that are sort of maybe in their first 5 years that have, thousands of customers instead of millions of customers. I don't expect those to last forever. Maybe they'll hang around. So I don't tend to review a lot of them because I'm not really certain about their future. And the challenging thing in DevOps is we spend way too much of our time already shifting from one tool to the next tool to the next tool. And we all need to sort of settle down, use the tools that work, that have been around for a while. Containers are not new, right? They've been here almost a decade. So Kubernetes and Docker are on that list of solid, consistent tooling. Terraform and Ansible are on that list. And then it's kind of choose your own adventure from there. I am very bullish on GitHub and GitHub Actions just because they've got the billions of dollars of Microsoft behind them, and I like it. A lot of developers and operators like it. It's free for certain things. It's available everywhere, and the marketplace is one to beat. I think it's the best place right now to do any automation work because there's so many different. If you can think of a tool, it's in GitHub Actions already, probably, and it already has automations and easy ways to use it. So that's not true of a lot of these other platforms, but your mileage may vary. It really kind of depends. Hopefully that helps. That's a great question, though. I just think that we're kind of in an area now where there's a lot of different automation tools, and what we all need to be doing is settling on one for our team and just trying to use that one, because what I end up finding is teams that get a new one doesn't quite replace the old one. They still got Jenkins, and then they get this new thing, and then there's another team that decided on something else, and it's just fractured automation that makes it really hard to keep everything working. And I recommend you consolidate, you keep it simple, and then you grow from there. I think the future is in these intelligent platforms that are doing some AI-ish machine learning things, but I think we're still ways off from that stuff really being there. And I think if those teams and companies are really good at making a good product, one of these big companies like Microsoft is going to buy them. VMware is going to buy them. AWS is going to buy. Someone's going to buy them. And then they'll just be pulled into the products that you're already using. That's my theory. Any good courses on K3S? Well, K3S has very little to it. It's a single binary, and I prefer to use it through K3D. You'll see me using K3S in my GitHub Actions. If you just went over to github.com/Bret Fisher, I have tons of examples here. And a lot of my examples are GitHub Action oriented now, and you will see them using K3D. K3D is running K3S inside of a Docker container, and it starts up in less than 30 seconds. So learn K3S. It's a simple binary. You can install it several different ways. It's no easier to maintain in terms of all the YAML you have to write, because it's still Kubernetes. So it's still going to need you to write Helm charts or customize or something. But when it comes to infrastructure, you now only have one binary per server to manage. K3D wraps K3S into a container and allows you to run it anywhere Docker is already running, like in a GitHub Action runner, or in any of your Jenkins runners, or any of these things that you might have for automation. Then you can run K3D there, probably easier because Kubernetes isn't there maybe, and you have Docker but not Kubernetes. So K3D just runs in Docker. It's great for testing. I love it for what I call smoke testing, where I can spin up a cluster in 30 seconds. These are all official Kubernetes distributions, so they run like any Kubernetes does. You use the same commands. It doesn't change a lot. So my focus and recommendation is just take my Kubernetes courses, learn Kubernetes, the fundamentals, and then K3S is just a couple of extra commands to install it and then update it whenever it gets an update. And that's all you really have to worry about until you become what I would call sort of a technical engineer on the Kubernetes cluster side. You've maybe taken your administrator certification, your Kubernetes certified administrator, and you're focused on cluster building and being a cluster expert on the internals. Like, you know the difference between cryo and container D, and you know how they run containers differently. So you are that level of engineer. That's when I think you really need to understand the internals of your provider, like K3S or Rancher, or you see we got Tanzu, and then we got the clouds. We got all these places. I always recommend people learn the clouds first when you're learning Kubernetes. Like, learn my Kubernetes courses and then go learn a cloud, the cloud your company uses, because that's most likely going to be where you run your Kubernetes. It's where I recommend you run Kubernetes, is in the cloud provided Kubernetes, because they're going to be better at running it than you are, than I am. We're just a single person. They have entire teams of people maintaining the versions, ensuring compatibility with all their cloud features. So I always recommend those, if at all possible. As a last resort, you build your own cluster. Now you have to maintain your own OS, your own patching, your own security, all that stuff. And I don't recommend that in case you don't have to. But that's a great question, Joe. So I don't have any good courses on K3S. Mostly because I'm not sure, other than just learning Kubernetes, it would maybe just be like a few lectures on, some of the install and upgrade commands for K3S. What troubleshooting tools do I recommend in Kubernetes? Recommending open source. Well, there are things that troubleshooting, a lot of times you're not troubleshooting the Kubernetes cluster. You're often troubleshooting your workloads, because your workloads aren't running right in Kubernetes. So it's essential at first that you know Kubernetes. You have to know the describe command, the explain command. You have to know the git command. You have to know the events command. You have to know all these different things so that these command lines will help you diagnose why your app isn't downloading, it isn't running, or it keeps restarting, right? Like that's the things you got to understand. How to pause a rollout, how to roll back. These are all standard things you got to know first. After that, Kubescape, which we had on the show recently. In fact, if you just go back in my channel, you can find the Kubescape episode. Kubescape is a scanner. It's not really a troubleshooting scanner, but it is a scanner that ensures proper configuration, particularly when it comes to security. So that might be something in your toolbox. Something else is Komojaru, or I'm not sorry, Komojaru. That's Commodore. Commodore they have stuff you can run locally. I'm not sure how much of them is open source, but Commodore is something, I think they just announced that they're working with SUSE and Rancher on a partnership, but that is a tool that's supposed to help you visualize problems in your cluster. There is a tool called NetShoot, which is really just a bunch of Kubernetes. It's really just a bunch of Linux tools inside a single container. So you can run this on your server. It's not going to do anything automated. It doesn't scan anything. But if you needed to run various network tools, this would be something you could use. By the way, if you didn't hear that, that is a jet. I live near a air base, and this weekend is the air show, which means the Blue Angels are here, and they're running right over my house. They're flying. I could actually go out on the deck, and I could wave at them and see them. So the Blue Angels are here, and you will probably get to hear them more throughout this hour. So let's see. What else besides that? Oh, troubleshoot.sh. Here's another troubleshooting tool. Troubleshooting tool from Replicated. They were on the show this summer, and we talked about this. So go back in this live show and find the Replicated episode. But this is a free tool that will scan your cluster and essentially pulls it all out, all the logs, all the YAML configurations. It pulls out everything and allows you to troubleshoot offline, essentially. And you can upload that sort of stuff. And it doesn't really, out of the box, the open source version, I don't think, I could be wrong, but it doesn't really tell you things that could be wrong, like maybe Commodore could do that. What it's going to do is, in the free version, it's going to give you all of the stuff you can analyze. And then you can write your own analyzers. Like you could write an analyzer that looks through the logs for a particular error message. And then this would automatically find those errors and tell you. It doesn't have, I don't think, a lot of that automation out of the box. They have a paid for version I do believe is adding some of these features, but you might want to check on exactly what is open source versus not open source. But that's another tool I have used in the past. And it's great because it creates a zip file bundle that you can then send to someone else to help you diagnose, because that zip file will have all the logs, all the events, all the YAML configurations of the cluster, and it'll help you. It also can do things like remediation. It can remove certain things that you don't want in your support bundle, but it has a lot of neat stuff there. It's really great for support teams to ask someone who's running a cluster to send them this diagnostic stuff, and that's kind of what troubleshoot.sh is. But that's just a few. Hopefully that gives you some good stuff. That's a great question. Love the Jets. How can I connect a Minikube from Kube Control from Linux machine? My Minikube running on a Windows machine on the same network. I have one Linux machine. How can I connect a Minikube from the Kube Control from Linux machine? Well, so when you're running stuff locally on your machine, let's say Minikube, it may not be accessible from outside your Windows machine. So I'm not sure if you're actually talking about you have a Linux server somewhere else that you want to come back into the Minikube. But if Minikube is using VirtualBox, and it depends on how your Minikube networking is set up, however that networking is set up, you got to make sure that that's using a public IP address on your host. Basically, it's going to need its own IP address on your network, and that's going to be very specific to the networking provider and how you have it running. So I can't really give you the fix or answer to that. Usually the answer is no. If you're running a VM on your Windows machine, usually that VM is not exposed to incoming traffic from your host physical network. That's there for safety, for preventing you from accidentally getting attacked, right? So you have to then usually, and not always, but usually you have to go in and change the networking of that networking provider, whatever that is, VirtualBox, Hyper-V, to make sure that that VM gets an external IP address. So go check that out. That's how you would do it. But normally, when I'm using Minikube, MicroK8s, Multipass, any of these things, I only expect it to be connected to from other machines in that same tool. I don't try to connect from outside of my machine. It is possible. It's just not going to work maybe automatically. Hopefully that works. Hopefully that helps. What does a day-to-day DevOps engineer do? I mean the activities. Now installing Minikube in Linux, I need to install. Oh, these are different questions. All right, so the first one, day-to-day activities of a DevOps engineer, they range widely because not every DevOps engineer does the same thing. In fact, there's probably a good dozen DevOps engineer type of jobs. DevOps engineer is a very generic title. It's like saying a software programmer. And, software programmer has nothing to do with the languages you're using. What are you, a mobile programmer, a server programmer, a front-end programmer? There's all sorts of different types of engineers for development. And the same is true of DevOps engineering. DevOps engineering is more of a mindset than it is an actual job role, but there's so many jobs out there that say DevOps engineer, so we've got to come up with something, right? You're usually going to be automating with a bunch of different standard tools. So you're going to be helping with server clusters, helping developers get their code into production, helping them test it and automate the testing. You're going to help with building images and shipping things to Kubernetes, right? You're going to be helping with the YAML, a lot of YAML. You'll probably be using tools that are for automation. All these automation tools I've been mentioning, you're probably going to be using other tools like a shell. You're going to need to learn Bash. You're going to need to learn some Bash scripting there. You might have to learn some package managers. So we're going to have to learn things like Python pip, or you're going to have to learn Node.js's NPM, or other tools that help you install programs like apt and yum. You'll need to learn Linux. Absolutely a core essential skill of DevOps engineers is you're going to be dealing with Linux, and you're going to be dealing with the cloud. So you're going to need to know at least one cloud, how to create infrastructure, how to manage that infrastructure. You're going to need to understand networking really, really well. So definitely take a course on TCP/IP, for learning all the IP in and outs of all those different protocols and how networking fundamentally works, because your whole job is going to be based around distributed computing, networking all the things together, automating the setup and tear down of infrastructure, and then automating code from your developers, getting from their machines into the testing, and finally into production servers. So that's a wide range of stuff, and that's not any one specific tool. So you better get started. There's lots of DevOps courses that will teach you tooling. What I always recommend is focusing on the courses that will teach you the mindset, because the mindset always has to come before the tooling. There's lots of people that are involved with DevOps and from a mindset that they aren't actually engineering solutions. They're just operating from a place of understanding the DevOps mindset. This includes project managers, product managers, tech support people, help desk. A lot of them can be involved with that DevOps process and those mindsets, but they have to learn those fundamentals. I think LinkedIn DevOps Foundations, I mentioned this several times. Oops. I should get money from this. But this is a learning course on LinkedIn. Just look up DevOps Foundations. Really great course. And it's dated, but it doesn't matter because it's about the ideas and the fundamentals. Automation, the ideas of automation, the ideas of measuring and improving based on measuring your systems and measuring your team performance, all those measurements, those don't change really. The tools might, but if you aren't learning the tools yet, it doesn't really matter. You can learn on an old course like this that's 6 years old and it still be completely relevant. So I recommend that one. at least until I have my own. All right, next question. Now installing Minikube on Linux, I need to install CRI-Docker-D and CRI control. Can you let me know why it is required now? I don't think you need Minikube on Linux. So the question is, why are you installing Minikube on Linux? If you're on Linux, on a Linux server, and you need to run Kubernetes, just run microcates. That's way easier than running Minikube itself. That's how I run something on, if I just need to run a quick Kubernetes cluster on one node, I just run microcates. It installs directly with Snap, and Minikube, you first have to install Minikube, then you have to set up a cluster, and it may require drivers or other things to be installed. I don't really use Minikube that much anymore. I find that if I'm on a Linux desktop, I just use Docker Desktop for Linux. If I'm on a Linux server, I'm going to probably install K3s or microcates. I'm going to install I'm going to be installing Kubernetes directly on that Linux machine. Minikube is really not meant for, even though you can install it on servers, it's not really meant for servers because it's usually running Kubernetes inside something like a VM or another Docker container or something like that. But if I'm going to run Kubernetes in a Docker container, I much rather use K3D, which is what I mentioned a while ago. K3D is a super fast way to spin up a container running Kubernetes inside it. When I say super fast, I mean like 20 seconds. So that's how I would run Kubernetes in a Docker container really quickly. But that's more for testing and local use. That's not for production, right? That's what microcates and K3s are, more production-oriented Kubernetes, as well as Rancher, all the other ones like that. Do I think Chef and Puppet are outdated? I don't know anyone still using Chef and Puppet. So I'm not going to really tell you don't use it. I'm not going to say they're outdated, but they are tools that were largely designed for server admins that needed to manage server infrastructure. But most of us need to be moving beyond that now. If we're in the cloud, then we should be using the cloud resources. And the cloud resources are moving us away from having to care about the OS, right? You can use Fargate, you can use Autopilot, you can use all these different things and the Kubernetes clusters they create that remove the need for you to manage infrastructure. So you should be moving your infrastructure to the services that the cloud provides you rather than manually building your own servers, having to patch them, having to lock them down, and then having to maintain them. That's really where the world of Chef and Puppet came from. And to a certain extent, Ansible. And so when you still need to manage servers, I mostly see people using Ansible for that. If you're a pure cloud-oriented team, you're just using Terraform. You can probably get away with not using Ansible. If you have to then spin up instances of servers, whether that's inside your data center or out, you're probably going to be using Ansible. Chef and Puppet are great if you already have them, but I don't see new companies adopting them. They have a lot of tools that are making them more modern and container native and all that stuff, but I don't live in a world where people use them. Doesn't mean they're not being used, just means my worldview shows that I don't know anyone using them anymore. So that's a great question. Thank you. JetBrains Space. I have not tried JetBrains Space. So K3D or Kind. I use Kind locally, but I don't know what the difference is, to be honest. Kubernetes so Kind is using the traditional upstream Kubernetes distribution. So it's got multiple binaries. K3D, they both deploy in a Docker container. K3D is just way faster. And so I personally no longer use Kind. I have replaced it completely with K3D because Kind was originally designed for testing and automation in testing of the Kubernetes project itself, and it stands for Kubernetes in Docker. Then eventually Rancher came up with the K3s idea, which was to bundle all the different binaries that you need for control plane into a single binary, make it easier to distribute it, make it easier to update. It's a smaller, faster thing, and it has certain things built in. Then K3D showed up to take K3s, wrap it in a container just like Kind does, and then allow you to run it just as easy as you run kind. But it's faster. It's faster to spin up. It's faster to replace. So I always rather use the faster thing. As an example, on GitHub Actions, which already has Docker installed, if I use kind, it takes around 4 minutes to spin up the cluster. If I use K3D, a very similar command, it's just a single command line. If I use K3D, it takes about 20 to 30 seconds instead of 4 minutes. So I find kind to be just slower, so I don't tend to use it anymore. How to use HA proxy as an Istio ingress gateway. I have no idea. I have used HA proxy, but not in the Kubernetes era. I used to use it way before Kubernetes. So I don't know how to do that. Istio is also a more advanced tool, so I tend to not recommend that for new people. If you're just getting used to ingress, I'm not sure if you're trying to use the new gateway API, because you said ingress gateway. So I'm not sure if you're trying to get to do service mesh or the gateway API or exactly what you're trying to do. But if I was someone, if it was someone that was getting started with ingress, I would recommend just use Nginx to start until you decide that you want to use something else like Contour or Traffic. Istio is more for a more advanced person that maybe wants to look into service meshes. The Gateway API is coming. It's still pretty new, but the Gateway API is a superset of Ingress. I don't believe the plan is to replace Ingress, but if you have more advanced needs and you need multi-clusters in tiers where you need like a front cluster and you need back clusters, you need really advanced stuff, that's where Istio and the Gateway API shine. So if you need those, yeah, check it out. But I don't really have any tips. Sorry. How can I convince my company to start using GitOps practices, specifically using Argo CD instead of endless bamboo agents? I am quite junior. Well, the way that I normally get this done is that I get permission to run a pilot project on something that doesn't matter, or maybe something that's running in parallel so that it's doing the same thing as the other work that is already going on, and I just do it in a way that no one cares, right? That it's not going to go down and cause problems. So I will then showcase that at a lunch and learn, or I will bring my team in, and you got to be in a culture that allows experimentation. So if your team is more of a top-down approach and they're not following DevOps practices of continual learning, then that's more of a fundamental problem than worrying about GitOps. You've got to get the team on the DevOps mindset, which means that you're continually experimenting, you're continually testing your own assumptions. And to do that means occasionally trying new tools to see if they're faster and easier at solving your problems. Not constantly, because there is that, constantly doing too much with too new tools. That I just talked about that 20 minutes ago. So you don't want to do that. But if you want to experiment with GitOps, you first need infrastructure as code. So are they doing infrastructure as code? Do they have DevOps mindsets where they want continual learning and continual improvement? If so, then you should be able to set up Argo with a fake cluster and show how you think it's better than Bamboo, right? If it's not, it will clearly show you that. Once you've done it, you've got to convince yourself that it's going to be easier and better. And then you just, maybe if your team isn't one that does continual learning together, where you have what I call lunch and learns all the time, then maybe make a video about it, just record your screen and send it out to the team. You're usually going to have different attitudes in a team. You're going to have certain people that are not going to want to change things, and then you're going to have people that are constantly looking for new ways to do things, and they're staying up on the latest technology. Those are the people that you need to ask first. You need to get their buy-in first. You don't want to go and try to change everyone's mind all at once. If you read the DevOps Handbook, which if you haven't read, I suggest you pick up the DevOps Handbook, 2nd edition. The DevOps Handbook talks about this. It talks about how you change a culture, and you change that by getting early, you get the people that are early adopters. You get them first. And then you leave the laggards, the people that don't want to change their ways, you leave them to last. Because you're going to need a lot of proof, a lot of evidence to convince them. And the way you do that is through getting other people to agree with you. And if you can't do that, then maybe the tool isn't worth changing. Because typically, if a tool is really that much better, eventually other people will catch on with why you like it so much. And if you're using it for demos, if you're doing show and tells, if you're making GitHub open source examples and then sharing them with your team like you should be doing, then they're going to catch on, and eventually a few people might like it. And then that's how you get the ball rolling. That's how I do it, at least. So good luck with that. Come back and let me know how it's progressing. A lot of times changing people's opinions can take a long time, longer than you want it to. But yeah. Great question. Please tell us the best Kubernetes free resources and is fresher can join as DevOps engineer. Well, watch this video. This channel has a lot of Kubernetes resources. I talk about Kubernetes every week for the last 3 years probably. So lots of videos here. I bring people on every week to talk about their Kubernetes tool. I don't have free courses, but you can get my courses for less than 20 American dollars with the coupons below. And then you can learn the basics of Kubernetes. And you don't need to know Kubernetes to be a DevOps engineer. There are plenty of DevOps engineer jobs that don't have you building Kubernetes clusters. To me, building a Kubernetes cluster is more of an ops engineer's job. So do what you're good at. Are you someone who knows how to develop software? Then you want to look for jobs that are closer to the dev side of DevOps. And there's jobs like that. There are jobs that are called DevOps engineers, but most of the job is simply automating the build and testing of your apps in containers. Some would call those build engineers, but they often get labeled as DevOps engineers. So look for those kind of jobs if you have that kind of experience. I'm always recommending that people try to find a DevOps job that's closer to their actual experience. If you don't have experience at all, then you should be taking every possible DevOps resource and putting them into your own GitHub repo as open source that you're creating to show off your skills. Make a blog, write about what you're learning, make videos on YouTube about what you're learning, make your resume public on GitHub like I do. And that way people can see what you're doing and what you're creating in open source. And then do the natural things. You've got to get certifications. First, go get a Linux certification, then get a networking certification, then get a cloud certification. Once you have all those, then you might look at DevOps certifications or Kubernetes certifications. But I wouldn't even look at those until you have the cloud, Linux, and networking. Those are the three things that every DevOps job has something in common with. Even if you're in a Windows shop and you have a lot of Windows servers, you're going to be dealing with Linux more and more. So you might as well learn and get a certification on it now. So hopefully that helps. Great question. Thank you. What is the best CI/CD GitLab for Kubernetes, Helm, or Argo? Maybe ask that question a different way. I'm not really sure what you're asking. Are you asking me if GitLab is the best CI/CD for Kubernetes? Or are you asking me the difference between Helm and Argo? I'm not really sure. So Argo is my recommended way to automate Kubernetes deployments. Argo wouldn't really do anything with GitLab other than you would store the Argo configuration in GitLab Git repos, just like you would in a GitHub Git repo. And then you would tell Argo where those repos are, and then Argo would update your Kubernetes cluster for you. It updates based on whether you use Helm charts or customize, or just standard Kubernetes YAML manifests. You can use at least those 3 different methods with Argo, and there is an ever-increasing list of formats like Helm, like customize, that Argo works with. Argo is something that runs in your cluster and then looks at your Git repos and can automate changes inside your cluster based on what you change in Git. So I recommend Argo for every cluster that I deploy. Every team that I work with uses Argo. Sometimes they might use Flux or Fleet. Those are 2 other options. There's other options as well, but Argo tends to be the first one that everybody tries. So I would do that. if that's the question. Helm and Argo CD. Yeah. Helm is just a format of YAML. Helm is templating for your resources. So when you first start out learning Kubernetes, you learn Kubernetes YAML manifests. Then as you need to make those templates, because maybe you need to run the same app in 3 different clusters, let's say, you want to template it. And your 2 choices there, the 2 main choices are Customize or Helm. If it's just for internal use in your company and you're just deploying your own apps, I recommend Customize. Customize is really easy to get started. It is normal YAML. It is not some templating language like Jinja, or how you say it. Jinja. I always mispronounce it. Which I think is the language of Helm, and that's a templating language that's more advanced. So Helm is more often used when you need to give your software away. Maybe you're an open source maintainer of an open source project and you want other people to use your app on their Kubernetes. That's great for Helm. I think for internal teams that are keeping it simple, keeping their apps simple, they don't have 20 different containers that are legacy, old, 20-year-old apps, then they can probably get away just fine with Customize and keep it simple. If you need to go to more advanced things like Helm hooks, which I'm not always a fan of, but Helm has more of those features in it. It's just more work to get started, and it's more advanced in its templating. So yeah. So those things have nothing to do with Argo. Argo can read all those different types of files and then tell your Kubernetes cluster when they're changed, essentially. That's what Argo does. Hopefully that helps. I'm glad that helped there, C. Dixon. Thanks. Would it be cool to have a GitOps way to use? Would be cool to have a GitOps way to use Ansible or even Terraform. Crossplane is an option, but a way less community providers, etc. Any thoughts? Well, I feel like if you use, Terraform has a GitOps way, in my opinion, because you can use Terraform Cloud, store it in a Git repo, a commit in the commit log is picked up by Terraform Cloud, and then it goes through a workflow based on your assumptions. It can automatically deploy. It can require human approval. It can do a plan, but it does it, and that's part of Terraform Cloud. And you can use Terraform Cloud for free for a certain amount. So I would say that it maybe doesn't check all the boxes for GitOps, but Terraform Cloud is pretty close. Like, I would check that out. I don't know about Ansible. So, but yeah, I feel like you're getting pretty close there. You're at least doing infrastructure as code, Git for change management. Those are 2 parts of GitOps, right? So I would try that, Terraform Cloud. If someone said to me, I got to use Terraform and I want the most to get GitOps-oriented way, I would say Terraform Cloud. Or an option with that is to use something like GitHub Actions, that you create your own Terraform commands, and then you're running Terraform and GitHub Actions based on Git changes. I like Terraform Cloud a little bit better because it's watching from the outside and it's a little simpler to get started, but you could do it with automation tool. And then one of the principles, by the way, of GitOps is that you don't need direct access to the cluster to deploy things. And you can do that with Terraform Cloud. The Terraform Cloud has access to the cluster to push changes to whatever infrastructure you need to manage. I say cluster, but I mean the cloud itself, the cloud APIs. So you can do that all with Terraform. And if you need to roll back, if you need to plan, if you need to copy and clone and diverge, you can do all that with Terraform using Terraform modules. So it's got a lot of that stuff there, I feel like, that's getting you pretty close to GitOps. Could I please suggest the best solution to monitor Kubernetes clusters? That's a really hard question to answer because there is no one-size-fits-all tool. It just depends on, do you want an open source tool? I prefer tools like Datadog, which monitor for me, right? That might be, if you just go look at the landscape, I really would probably at the end of the day recommend all these tools in the landscape. And if you just find card mode, let's see, category, observability, let's just do monitoring. So you have a lot of tools there, right? These are all monitoring tools inside landscape.cncf.io. And they all have their own strengths and weaknesses. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist, right? So you could filter and say it has to be open source. You could filter there. And you're going to see things like Prometheus. But Prometheus, to run on your own, it's a great tool. It requires a suite of tools. It's not just the one thing you need to run. You're going to need to run lots of things. And you're going to have to do lots of work. So I don't tend to want to do that. There are other tools coming out, like Weave. Weave has their own thing. Grafana has their own platform now. And these are all platforms that are cloud-based platforms, which are way easier to get started and often free for like 3 or 5 nodes. The Grafana one I've used, Datadog, which is a completely separate platform, but I've just used them forever, and they work. And they're not cheap, but that's because they're amazing and they do lots of stuff. So they now do logging and monitoring and everything all in one solution. If I looked up Grafana, got to spell it right. The Grafana platform. Let's see. Where's their SaaS platform? Not so you can use the open source, but I was looking specifically for the maybe it's just the stack. Yeah, so for Grafana Labs stack, Grafana Cloud, that's what I was kind of looking for, and that includes all the stuff you really need to get started, but it's not near as mature as something like Datadog, right? Well, it's not as expensive either, so it's a cheaper option. I tend to want to do those rather than running my own. I mean, running your own is great for a hobbyist, but if you're running business stuff, like that business should want to pay a little bit of money to make sure their stuff is monitored and the logs are stored and it's all that stuff, right? Just like backups. So I would rather do a cloud-hosted solution than depend on my skills, which I'm already so busy on just my skills alone for maintaining a logging solution, a monitoring solution, an observability solution. Like all those things are wrapped in together. You can run separate tools or a single tool that does all of it. It's just there's a lot of stuff out there. So it's hard for me to recommend one without knowing your team size, the scope of how much infrastructure you have, what is your skill set, like how good are you at this stuff, what's your budget, what timeline do you have for the project. These are all factors that would help in a decision on which tool you need to do, right? If you need the fastest tool, you have a good budget, and you have very few people, Datadog or Grafana Cloud. Those would probably be my two. If you're running in the cloud, you should try the cloud that you're in. You should try their tools first. They might be enough for now. And a lot of times they're free or very cheap. And so try those because they all have Kubernetes plugins now, right? They all have connections to Kubernetes and all that stuff. If I had to pick one, Argo CD or Flux, Argo CD. It's not that I don't like Flux. It's just it's not the tool that I used to use Flux because it was the kind of the first tool around. Then Argo showed up a little bit later. Now Argo CD is backed by a company. I mean, Flux is backed by a company too, but Argo CD is trying to become more and more, and I'm not sure if Flux is continually expanding its scope. But Acuity was just on the show recently, and Acuity is the company behind Argo, and they've already got Argo CD, Argo Workflow, the other Argo tools, and they now have a cloud SaaS platform behind it that's meant to just make it even easier for managing your Argo. And so I like the direction they're going, and I like the people that started it, and they're really focused on this specific problem. So I just I like them. I also know them way better than I do Flux because I haven't used Flux in probably 3 years. So that's mostly it's not me doing an equal comparison. I just know it better, and all the teams I work with use it already. So it tends to be the one that people are using. In terms of logging practices, do you have a recommendation approach to trim down mammoth levels of noise? We are using Elastic and a lot of storage. Well, I think this is a longer conversation, but I think one of the tricks there is that you've got to get the developers and the operators to work together. You can't simply have the developers doing debug level dumping of information on all servers and then expecting ops to figure it out. Like, you just shouldn't be doing that. So what you should be doing is looking into the future of observability. So here's my recommendation. Go look up prior KubeCon, Cloud Native Con, right? That's the conference that's next month. If anyone's going to be there, tell me, and we will. You got to get in the Discord server over there. Discord server, there's a KubeCon room. We're going to hang out at KubeCon. But go look up previous KubeCons and look for observability. And you need to start learning that what's happening now is that the really leading edge teams are changing from just everything is dumping into generic log entries to actually making more of their information metrics. Less logging, more metrics. So every one of your developers that make a custom app, they should be focusing on their metrics as much or more than their logging, right? Because a lot of times it's the metrics that matter more than the logs. And what we end up doing back in the old days, we would say, well, if the log entry says this, then count it. And I want to know the average number of those that are coming in every minute, right? So that means you're counting log lines and then making a metric out of it, which you shouldn't be doing. What the app should be doing is exposing metrics directly that you can then capture with something like Prometheus and then put those on a dashboard like Grafana. So Loki is one of those futures around that idea. Loki, just look up Grafana Loki. That's this idea that we need to rely less on logs, and logs need to be there only as a last resort. And so if you're logging too much, the way to solve that is to get your teams to rethink about metrics and changing those log entries to metrics rather than log entries. Anyway, it's a whole thing. There's lots of videos on YouTube about it. Just look up observability, Kubernetes, cloud native, open tracing is another keyword, open tracing. That's kind of changing to open telemetry. So, for example, this is kind of where everything is coming together is an open telemetry. And that's the mindset. And you've got to work with your teams, both operators and devs, to change this mindset. Someone's at entryway. Someone is at the entryway. All right. We're going to have to wrap this up because I've been going an hour and a half. So let's go through some rapid fire questions. Hopefully I've answered a lot of your questions today. Continuous learning, continuously based. Portainer is okay solution to help monitor them depending on what you actually need. Yeah, Portainer's got some basics built in. Also, the dashboard for Kubernetes might be considered a lightweight monitoring tool, but not really because it doesn't alert, it doesn't have rules and all that stuff. So you're going to need a more advanced solution at some point. You are most welcome for all these answers, and I appreciate you all showing up and giving me great questions. Yeah, Grafana exporters, that's a great suggestion. What is the least privileged method for image pull? Because AWS, EKS, and ECR. The least privileged method for image pull between EKS and ECR. I'm not really sure I understand that question. Sorry. The least privileged method? Well, when you're pulling an image, you have to have access at the cluster to be able to pull. So I'm not exactly sure what you're asking there. ECR is where you store the images. Maybe you're asking me about security groups and permissions inside of AWS. And if you are, sorry, I can't help you with that. I'm not going to be able to rattle off the exact permissions for ECR access. So yeah, I'm not going to be able to help you with that. Sorry. I don't do it enough. Like, it's one of those things where you have a template, you can probably find a template, they probably provide templates, and then you just use that role. And I don't know those off the top of my head. Sorry. How do you organize your Terraform projects? Is there any best practice or tip you want to advise? I tend to, for a team, and when you get a team of like 3 or 4 people, I tend to keep all the Terraform in a single repo. And I separate them out by directories. And then if you want to make reusable modules out of different parts of your Terraform, then you might keep that either in a separate directory or in a separate repo so that you can plug in your modules for reuse so that you don't have to keep using the same thing over and over again. So that's something that I do. I don't try to make 1,000 different repos or a repo per project or anything like that. It just depends a lot of times on permissions too. If you have one team managing all your Terraform, then yeah, just one repo, maybe 2, one for modules, one for the actual Terraform. But if you're a very large organization, you have different teams and each team has their own person, then you probably have to make different repos based on security rules, right? I tend to start everything in infrastructure as one repo for that thing. Ansible gets its own repo, Argo gets its own repo, Helm gets its own repo, but I don't try to make a bunch of them unless I absolutely have to, just to keep it simple. Clear roadmap for DevOps. I'm not going to have an answer for that. I'd say that if there's any other opinions I have on DevOps, it is brett.show/DevOps, and I'll put that in chat. You can go there. That will be a page that gives you some opinions, some links, some references, some guides. Just go through there and add more questions or add your own opinions. That's mostly people asking about, hey, I need to get into DevOps. Either I'm a sysadmin or I'm an engineer or a developer. How do I get into it? And so that's what that's for. Hopefully that helps. What is a Docker volume and how to create it? So take my courses. My courses, my Docker Mastery course, links below. You can get it for less than $20. That course is designed to teach you all the basics of Docker, Docker images, Docker containers, Docker volumes, registries, Swarm, Kubernetes, all those things, right? Those are all in that course. And it is the, I believe, world's most popular Docker course with almost 300,000 people have taken it. So at least I think it's one of the most popular. I think it might be the most popular, but that's just me. So check that out. There's also videos in this channel, but I'm not sure I have a video that's specifically in this channel that says this is the answer to the question, what is a volume? Like there's lots of videos I have here that talk about volumes, but you want to take the course to do that. How is AppMesh? It's integrated with EKS, Fargate, and what do we get instead of ingress controllers to expose services outside? I don't know. If anyone else knows the answer to that question in chat, let me know. I am not someone who knows AppMesh. Mono repos are fine. You can split things up or you can make them in one mono repo. Doesn't matter. If you're going to use a mono repo, you have to make sure that your automation has the ability to scope changes based on branch and directory. If you don't, your mono repos will start doing a lot of things they don't need to do. Because let's say you have 3 different things. Let's say you have 3 different microservices in a mono repo, or 20. If your automation, for example, GitHub Actions has a feature where it will only fire that automation if this one subdirectory changes. That's what you need in automation in order to scope changes for just a particular part of your app or a particular part of your infrastructure. So I would say when it comes to mono repos, keep it simple. Don't make a bunch of repos if you don't have to. But there's a balance, and that's different for every single team. It has to do with politics, how your organization is structured, what kind of apps you're running, all that sort of thing. And I would say that always try to isolate things into clean directory structures. Don't start cobbling things together. Don't create shared areas of stuff, because when you start doing that in your folder structure, it will be really hard to automate the different parts as they change. For example, if you change one app, you don't want your automation to deploy all the apps. So you have to make sure your automation can understand the structure of your file system in a monorepo. If you don't want to have to worry about that, then never make a monorepo. Put everything in their own repo, and then you just have a lot of repos to deal with. And that's a different problem, right? So you have a problem either way. It's up to you. Great question, though. I'm trying to find a solution to restrict access to AWS ECR repos at the namespace level. Mounting secrets in namespaces gives access to all AWS ECR repos. Yeah, again, I'm not going to have very specific solution. You know, when it comes to something on AWS and a specific problem on that AWS thing, I don't live my life in AWS like I used to. I'm across many different clouds and data centers, and I'm usually helping people operate their DevOps tooling. I'm not necessarily what you would call a cloud operator at that level with AWS. So unfortunately, I don't have those kind of answers off the top of my head. If I had to have that problem myself, I would have to go research it just like you. So I would then learn it and I would do it and then I would forget it because I probably would never do it again, or I'd only do it once or twice. So apologies that I don't have a lot of these answers for AWS specific stuff. I don't actually co-locate deployment code with app code. Usually, no. The way I structure this all is the Docker file goes in with the app because the Docker file is like your package JSON. It's like your installer, your package management, right? The Docker file is how that app gets built. So for every app, there is a Docker file in the root of that app. If there is Helm chart or Kubernetes YAML, that is usually environment specific. The Docker file is not environment specific. It is generic. The customized files or the Helm charts, those are environment specific usually. So I have to put those in a separate repo because I will probably need to make a copy of those for each environment, right? Dev, test, staging, production. And so you don't want all those mixed in with your app. You sometimes will I recommend putting the compose file in with your app. Usually you only need one compose file for the whole solution. So if your app is like 5 different repos, just pick one of them to put your compose file in. And I still recommend using compose and the compose file for local development. And then when your devs want to test on Kubernetes, they will need to download usually the Helm chart or the customized repo and run that stuff locally if they want as well. You can technically, if you wanted to develop on Kubernetes, which I don't always recommend. I usually don't recommend developing on Kubernetes because that's not what its purpose is. And if you're making your apps to where they have to be developed on Kubernetes, you're probably doing it wrong. A lot of the big cloud people like Kelsey Hightower do not develop in Kubernetes. They don't even develop in containers actually, but they're using languages like Golang and Rust and a lot of these more modern statically compiled languages. Anyway, if you're going to develop in Kubernetes, then you might keep some simple Kubernetes manifests in with your app, but that's the exception. And that's not going to be probably the same YAML that you're going to be using in production with Argo. So they're going to have to be in separate repos anyway, right? For instance, when my app gets built, this is all about automation. So when my app gets a commit, it gets a change in the main branch. I want my app to auto build and test every time, right? Every time there's a PR, I want it to auto build the image, Docker image of the app, test the app, and if it succeeds, push it to the registry. I have a different workflow for my Helm charts. My Helm charts might change and need to be redeployed, but the app hasn't changed. So I want these things in separate places because they're often separate workflows. They might even be separate teams. So that's what I usually keep them separate. I usually have Terraform in its own, Helm in its own, Argo in its own, because Argo is going to look at the Helm, right? It's going to follow the Helm chart. And then the Helm chart is going to be based upon the version of the images you want to ship to each environment. And you might have different versions in staging versus production. So your app needs to be living by itself because it's going to have its own testing workflows, its own iterations. And then your environments, each environment in your Helm repo, let's say, or your customized repo, that's going to have different versions of the images for every environment because you're not going to deploy the same version of your images to all the environments all at once. So you're going to have different ones in different folders. And then you're going to have a separate repo that's defining the Argo CD configuration, and that's going to have each app. And that each app configuration for Argo is going to point to the environments in Helm or Customize, which will then use images that are built from your registry of your application Git repo. So these all kind of need to be separate places. If they're all in one, then your automation has to know the subdirectories, and you have to be very clear that, for example, the Helm subdirectory does not affect the image. So you're going to have to set up rules that say, when I change the Helm, don't rebuild the image, because the Helm has nothing to do with the image and the app code, right? So you're going to have to do a lot of work if you try to do a mono repo with that. You're going to have to make sure your permissions and your watchers, essentially your automation watchers, are going to have to make sure they know exactly which files are for which automations. That's why I prefer to just split it all up, so that my automation doesn't accidentally fire off when something changes that I didn't want it to change, or whatever. Hopefully that helps. What DevOps areas and scope most motivates me? It's the automation side of things is what I really get excited about. I love automation. I love being able to take what previously took me 2 hours a week to do and then just automate that, or something that the team has to do 10 minutes a day for every person, and then I automate that. I always love that kind of automation stuff. And then observability, I guess, maybe is an area that I have passion in, but I don't spend a lot of time on, because I love being able to investigate and troubleshoot things with a lot of really good tools. So I like to have good monitoring and logging, and then see what tools work better for knowing what's going on. All right, I'm going to wrap this up. Where to learn for CRAs and K8s from scratch? Well, Kubernetes, you learn in my courses, which I have links below to 4 courses. 2 of them teach you Kubernetes. Those courses, I have coupons below. You can get those courses. Thanks for the question. Yeah, it always depends. Automation and team makeup, it matters more about your team structure and your organization than it does the tooling. A few times I run into tools that can't do Git scoped based on directories, so it then can't be used for mono repos because it can't see the difference between one directory and another, and so it's always going to fire anytime there's a change, and I don't want that a lot of times. A lot of times I want my automations to only fire if certain files change. So that's like step 1. What can I try if BuildX cannot create ARM architecture images for certain microservices using GitHub Actions workflows? Well, first off, I build my ARM images using GitHub Action public workers, so you can do it. Docker has the QEMU. So if you've looked up all the GitHub Actions for Docker from Docker, they have the QEMU one, which I use to build all of my course images, dozens of them, with ARM. That's using QEMU emulation. If you can't do that, then you would want to run your own GitHub Action runner on ARM using the Graviton instances on AWS, for example. Those are really cheap, and it doesn't take a lot of work to set one up, and you can just set a couple of them up and run them in AWS, put the runner app on those, and then you now have your own private runners, and you can set up your runs to say that if it's for ARM, go use these instances and my runners, right? So you can do that. Hopefully that helps. That's a great question on database consistency. I'm not sure if I'm going to have a really great answer for you, but the application, you should always be tying. So a couple of rules, general rules, is that your databases should be versioned, your schema should be versioned, so that you can then update the schema versions when you're needing to update them with app code. And then ideally, you're creating separate commands and automations that you're testing on how to roll forward, roll back those database schema updates. And there are multiple. If you just look up database schema management, if you just look that up, you'll find multiple open source tools for doing that. And there's at least 3 or 4 big ones. They'll all show up in the default page of GitHub. I'm sorry, of Google. You'll see all the results there, and those are the players. And I would recommend you adopt one of them. Sometimes, if you're in Rails, for example, there is one built in, but you may not always have that for every language. So look at your language, see what frameworks that language recommends, and yes, you want definitely schema versioning. One of the reasons you want that is because not every application is going to be at the same version of schema, because you're going to have different versions of your app, right? Another reason is you're going to want to run your databases locally for local development. And you're going to want to have people seeding their own databases with the proper schema version and the proper seeding of data. And you want to put all that in your Docker Compose tool. You want to put that all in these tools so that you can just spin it all up locally. And I always do that for a developer team I'm working with, is we use whatever database schema tool they're using. We automate it inside of Compose. And that way a developer can go from 0 to full development platform locally on their machine in minutes by just using a Docker Compose up. That's what we do. All right. Let's see. All right. 2 more questions and I got to run. It's been, I'm losing my voice. Let's see. A lot of times frameworks have a migration framework. Yeah. It's a lot about your language. Use Spring. Yeah, I mean, most languages have frameworks in them that help with schema versioning. There are attempts. The ones I was talking about with Google, those are attempts at being application language agnostic, which in teams, increasingly now, we have multiple languages in the team, right? Not just front end and back end, but also multiple back end languages. I have teams that they are using Ruby, but they're moving to Golang, or they're in Node.js and they're moving to Rust or Golang or something else. And so the problem is that each one of those languages would have their own database framework. And one of the other big rules about databases and distributed systems is that you don't want to be dealing with 2 different schemas for the same database. You don't want 2 different apps to manage the schema for the same database, which means if you have a bunch of different parts of an app, you're probably going to have one app that sits in front of your database and provides an API-like experience for accessing the database. Because one of the challenges is if you have 5 different apps all talking to the same database directly, then when you need to update that database schema, you might have to update all 5 apps at the same time because of a breaking schema change. And you don't want that. You want to limit, because that gets really, really complicated really fast. So ideally, you're putting something as a middle layer between your database and all of your other apps, and then that app is managing the schema, because that's the only one that has to change for that database. And of course, you're going to have many databases. So for each database, just make sure you have one app that's responsible for that schema. And then everything else has to go through that app and rely on that app for the schema update. That way you can have, API calls for old versions and new versions and all that sort of stuff too. Because I see teams that they don't do this, and then they try to do cloud native and they try to do distributed computing, and it becomes very hard to do 0 downtime upgrades when your applications all have to wait on a database upgrade before they can be updated, but their version won't work with the old update. So then everything has to come down for a period of time, maybe a few hours. And that doesn't work well in modern DevOps practices where we expect everything to always be available. So I would say invest some time in that if you haven't already. There's books on the subject. I am not the expert. I'm just someone who does this with teams of experts that do it for me. So, and with that, these are all great questions. Okay, one last question. This is it. This is the last one. We've hit the last one. You win. What do you think about developing data sets as stateful sets in Kubernetes in terms of complexity for production? I'm not sure what you mean by data sets as stateful sets in Kubernetes. I'm not sure actually what that even means. A stateful set is a set of pods, and pods run applications. So a data set is something that you're dealing with a database on. So I'm not really sure what exactly that question is. Maybe you can quickly give me a revised question. And I'll be waiting. So while we're waiting on you to see, databases MySQL. All right, so ask the complete question again so that I completely understand the question, because I still don't think I'm getting it. So while you're giving me some info on that, I will just remind everybody, you can sign up. Next week is our big high fivers. Every month, the people that basically in our Discord server, you can see over here, we have a special Discord server room for the patrons, and every month we get together and hang out. To do that, you need to pay a little entry fee, essentially of $5 a month, and then you can hang out with DevOps and do sort of our monthly high fiver hangout. You can also check out the loot store, of which you can see all the swag that I'm wearing, and I got my cups now, and we have Foxy as new stuff just launched today. We just launched today the Foxy stuff. And if you recognize any of my course stuff, you could recognize Foxy because she's in some of the courses. And then the other things I wanted to announce were that I'm doing course updates. So you can follow along with those in my GitHub repo. You can just find those there. And I'm tracking everything as GitHub issues. So if you have an update in the course, chances are that's already being tracked. But let me know if you find issues. And then if you didn't know, there's a new extension out that I talked about at the beginning of the show. So you can watch this show, or you can go back a month and watch a whole show we did on it. So, all right, back to the last question. You mean databases, MySQL, Oracle? What do you think about deploying databases as stateful sets in Kubernetes in terms of complexity for production? Okay. Yeah. If you're a database expert and you already know these databases really, really well, and you know how to set up their replication and manage them and do backups on them and monitor them and do all that stuff, then fine. Totally, you can do that in Kubernetes. If you're doing that today on real machines, on physical hosts or VMs, then doing it in containers is just a little bit extra work. But if you're not doing that today, I don't recommend it. Why? Why not just use the clouds? Yeah, they're more expensive, but you're expensive too, and you probably don't have any more free time. So unless you want to be responsible for monitoring, backups, restores, replication, redundancy, failover, fault tolerance, if you want to be responsible for all that, sure, there are people that do that, and that is a job. But if you're not trying to do that, and you're trying to avoid that work, which I always try to avoid maintaining my own infrastructure if I can use the cloud. So I would use the cloud. Otherwise, you're going to look for a Helm chart that implements production quality redundancy of your database system that you've tested to make sure that it's truly failover and redundant. And then you're going to need to do backups. So you're going to have to install something like Valero for backups to manage backup and restores. And you're going to have to test those like you should be doing. So that's just a lot of work. It's up to you whether you want to do it. There's tons of people that do it. So it's a legitimate thing that you absolutely can do. It's just a question of if you want that work on your plate. So yeah, hopefully that helps. I would not be scared of it. If that's your job to run databases in production, then don't be scared of it. Do it in Kubernetes. It's been done for years by many people. So hopefully that helps, and good luck. Yeah. So thank you, everybody. I will be here again next week. So who's coming next week? Next week is going to be all about service mesh. I've got Nick and Lee, the two friends. Lee Calcote is a Docker captain. He runs Meshery. He's going to be here next week, bringing his friend Nick. They're going to talk all about service mesh and Meshery, a product for easily deploying service mesh and then comparing and testing different service meshes. So we're going to be doing that next week. Then the week after, we've got Rosemary coming back from HashiCorp. Rosemary Wang is going to talk all about more HashiCorp projects. And then after that, we've got Brian Christner back on the show. We're going to be talking DevOps stuff. We've got the founders of ChainGuard who are going to be on next month. And then I'm going to be at KubeCon. So if you're going to be at KubeCon, let me know in Instagram, Twitter, whatever your favorite tool is. So let me know. We're organizing a KubeCon room over on the Discord server. So you can get that right above me, devops.fan. Sign up. If you're going to be at KubeCon, join in the room. Tell us you're going to be there. And so far, we only got 2 people. But hopefully, some of you will be there if you're lucky enough. I did not make it to KubeCon in Spain earlier this year. So I'm excited to have my first KubeCon of 2022 in Detroit. And I will hope to see you there. Otherwise, the podcast comes out on every other Friday. Check out the podcast. All those links below, including course coupons. And I will see you again next week on YouTube Live at this exact time.